right, so hello everyone. Welcome to the USCSO Spring Conference 2023 edition. My name is Ashani Chetri and I'm the president of the US-China Strategic Studies Organization. Welcome to our event. The first thing I would like to say is good evening, everyone. My name is Ashani Chetri, like I just said, and on behalf of all of us here at USCSO, I would like to excitedly welcome all of you to our most anticipated event of the year. This is our second annual Spring Conference, and so this conference is just a glimpse into the capabilities our members possess to organize and execute a successful event. We were founded back at the start of 2020, just before the pandemic, and grew from a presence solely on Zoom to now a room filled with curious students, distinguished professionals, and in general, US-China watchers. At last year's conference, we delved into the future of the US-China relationship with two of the world's leading experts in US-China relations, who also happen to be GW professors, David Shambaugh and Robert Sutter. This year, we are explaining why China behaves the way it does politically by discussing its notable leader, Xi Jinping. We hope to expand current conversations on elite Chinese leadership with questions like, what is the underlying guiding philosophy and strategy of Xi Jinping heading into his third term? And has the Chinese Communist Party under Xi Jinping grown more ideological? To help us in understanding domestic Chinese politics, our first moderator of the night will be Dylan Shepard. Dylan is a director of research in the USCSO and a sophomore studying international affairs and economics. Later on in the night, Kyle Lim will moderate the Young Professionals panel for in-person attendees. Kyle is the director of newsletter in USCSO and a junior studying international affairs and history. Both have done incredible work in preparing for tonight's conversations, and they are looking forward to leading their respective segments. A couple of housekeeping rules before we officially begin. For audience members here in the City View room, please refrain from frequently moving inside or outside of the room during the moderated speaker discussion and panel segments. During Q&As periods, your in-person audience members may raise their hands and a microphone will be handed to them once they've been called on. Live stream attendees for the moderated speaker discussion may submit their questions via the chat on Zoom, and a USCSO member here will read them aloud. Please note that we will only be recording the first segment, Xi Jinping, where he came from, where he's going, which will be published and widely available on our YouTube channel. Without further ado, please give a round of applause for our first moderator of the night, Dylan Shepard, and his introduction of our guest speaker, Dr. John Turigian.
Well, good evening, everyone. It's lovely to see so many familiar faces, but it's even more encouraging to see so many new people that perhaps haven't been to a USCSO event before. So we do hope that you enjoy our programming tonight. And if you do so, to check out our future upcoming speaker and discussion events later on in the year. Before I give way to our esteemed guest tonight, Dr. Joseph Turigian, to discuss our main topic about Xi Jinping's underlying philosophy and ideology, I'd like to speak a little bit more about his professional background and research experience. Dr. Turigian is a Global Fellow at the Wilson Center in their History and Public Policy program, where he conducts research on grand strategy, authoritarian elite competition, and as well as the Cold War. Before at the Wilson Center, he was their China Fellow working at the Asia program, and also at the Kissinger Institute of the United States and China. Outside of his work at the Wilson Center, he is an assistant professor at the School of International Service at American University. I know some GW students may be feeling a little bit uneasy having someone from our rival school speaking, but I assure you, actually, Dr. Turigian does have some roots here at GW. It wasn't so long ago that he was a pre-doctoral fellow at the Institute for Security and Conflict Studies here at GW. And actually, for his book, which was recently published, which is, here you go, Prestige, Manipulation, and Coercion, Elite Power Struggles in the Soviet Union and China After Stalin and Mao, he actually referenced our GW Asia Library and the National Security Archive. So I think, rest assured, he's safe to be the den of GW. But something I think that you can see in the title of this book is that Dr. Turigian is not like most Chinese specialists. You can see in his work, he really focused on elite competition, looking at how structures and Leninist regimes impact the way that Chinese elite politics unfolds. And I think personally, it reminds me sort of a different, older generation of scholarship on Chinese studies, more towards the Cold War era. I also highly encourage you all to purchase Dr. Turgian's book, which is now available via Yale University Press, which you can purchase online. And if for some reason post-Mao and post-Stalin elite competition doesn't strike your interest, he is currently working on a book manuscript that's going to be published with Stanford University Publishing that's about a biography of Xi Jinping's father, Xi Zhongxun, which I suppose is a great way of leading into our discussion tonight about Xi Jinping, where he came from and where he's going. And so without further ado, please give a round of applause to our esteemed guest, Dr. Joseph Turgian.
Great. Well, first of all, thank you for that wonderfully generous introduction. It is coming home. I did a pre-doctoral fellowship literally in this building, and I just finished teaching my qualitative methods seminar to the PhD students at the School of International Service that ended at 5:20, and I had a special guest star also from GW, Malcolm Byrne from the National Security Archive, to talk about the wonderful work that they do to make evidence accessible for people who study all corners of the world. But as you were saying, I did a lot of research right here in your Asia library. I know that Professor David Shambaugh has gone to terrific lengths to get a lot of material that you literally can't get anywhere else. So thank God for the Interlibrary Consortium, because they take advantage of that quite a bit, even though it means that I'm not coming down here physically to GW campus. So I've been asked to talk about 10 minutes about Xi Jinping, maybe the most powerful and mysterious person in the world. So I will do my best with that, but I look forward to the questions that Dylan has, as well as questions from all of you. I know that people in this room really look at China very closely, and I'm sure that you have your own thoughts, and I'm sure that we'll have an interesting back and forth. So I think that there are two increasingly common views of Xi Jinping, especially here in DC, that I want to talk about tonight. The first view is that Xi Jinping has ended reform and opening, that he only cares about security, that we now have, unlike in the past, an ideological China, a Marxist China, and a China no longer interested in economic development. Kevin Rudd, the former Prime Minister of Australia and now the Australian ambassador to the United States, wrote recently that during the 20th National Party Congress, Chinese leader Xi Jinping brought the Deng Xiaoping era of Chinese politics to a definitive close. It gave Xi an unprecedented third term as leader and removed pro-market officials from the CCP's leadership. After nearly 44 years, history will record that it was this Congress that administered the last rites to Deng's reformist era. And over the last 2 weeks, there have been two articles, one in the Wall Street Journal and another in the New York Times, also stating emphatically that the Deng Xiaoping reform and opening era has come to a close. So that's one view of a new ideological China. The second view has to do with the nature of elite politics. This idea that Xi Jinping has installed incompetent loyalists, that he's more dominant than ever, that he has gone beyond Mao Zedong and Deng Xiaoping in the extent to which he promotes people from his own faction, that he's rejected norms from the Deng Xiaoping era about collective leadership and succession, and that all of this will make China more unpredictable. One writer at the Atlantic Monthly wrote, "The actual results of Xi Jinping's policies suggest that he is weakening, not strengthening China as a competitor of the United States. The longer Xi remains at China's helm, the less competitive the country may become." So both of these two views, I think, are beneficial if you are hoping for a weakened China. And I think that people who identify a shift under Xi Jinping are onto something. He cares deeply about ideology, and he's always been worried about the political implications of market principles. And he sees increasing security concerns as the relationship with the United States deteriorates. And I also agree that his selection of individuals close to him raise concerns about the quality of decision-making that we can't ignore. But tonight, what I want to suggest to you is that we shouldn't essentialize Xi Jinping as someone who doesn't care at all about the economy, or make sweeping assumptions about Xi's new style of leadership after the Congress. I want to make a case for more continuity, both within the Xi era and before, suggesting that he is a cagey, even cunning individual who will shift among competing priorities in the face of real political and economic incentives and constraints, and may show more flexibility and pragmatism than some of these analysts have suggested. So let me begin with ideology and then move on to elite politics to explain why I think this is the case. Well, there are some differences in the political report for the 20th National Party Congress. Xi aims to improve the personal income tax system and better regulate wealth accumulation. He also, perhaps dramatically, says that the only way for the Chinese Communist Party to survive is through self-revolution, that to escape the dynastic cycle that faced China during the imperial era, the party needed to draw upon revolutionary traditions to maintain that elan and ensure that the regime does not separate itself from the people. When you read the document, it begins with Marxism, and there's a lot of Marxism in it. But when you look closely, there are striking elements of continuity as well. Xi is very careful when he talks about Marxism. He says that Marxism was only a success in China because it was Sinicized and subjected to careful practical tests. He says that Marxism is not a dogma, but a guide. He says Marxism cannot provide a roadmap because China is doing something completely new. And in January of 2022, he said that the words of Marx and Lenin and Engels should not be directly applied to China's current practical situation. And in that same speech, he condemned the Cultural Revolution as the most serious setback and loss since 1949. The document also has a lot about reform and opening. It says that the CCP will foster a world-class business environment. And after the Congress, on the day of the announcement of the new Politburo Standing Committee, Xi Jinping said, China's development cannot leave the world's development cannot leave China. At present, China's economy has strong resilience, sufficient potential, and wide room for maneuver, and its long-term fundamentals will not change. China will only open its door wider and wider. We will unswervingly deepen reform and opening up in an all-around way. What's interesting is when he talks about common prosperity, which has often been identified as this term that indicates that Xi Jinping is pursuing Marxist transformational goals, he contextualizes this idea whenever he refers to it. In December of 2021, Xi Jinping talked about common prosperity in sort of Goldilocks terms, saying that China doesn't want to be a Western country, but it also doesn't want to be a Latin American country, wants to avoid the populism of the Mao era, but also the income disparity extremes of reform and opening. The first priority is to make the cake bigger, not divide cake. I also want to talk about what he means when he says struggle in this document. So struggle also is a apparently radical leftist term. Struggle has meant different things at different times in the Chinese political context and has often been misunderstood. So if you look at my book, you'll see that in the first 2 years after the purge of the Gang of Four, the so-called key link, meaning the primary goal that the entire party was supposed to pursue, was class struggle. But as soon as the Gang of Four were smashed, Hua Guofeng stated explicitly that the manifestation of class struggle was to destroy all the remnants and supporters of the Gang of Four. And that was misunderstood to believe that he was more dogmatist than he really was. When Xi Jinping talks about struggle, I think what he's talking about is putting the lightning of revolution in a bottle, but to keep it in there, and to draw upon revolutionary traditions in a way that rededicates the party to faith in the past, to using stories about party history to motivate people. But it doesn't mean the kind of struggle that happened during the Cultural Revolution. And one of the reasons I believe that is, if you want to talk about people who suffered during the Cultural Revolution, there are a few people who suffered more than the Xi family. Xi Jinping's half-sister was persecuted to death. His father was kidnapped from Red Guards while he was already exiled to a factory in Hunan province, dragged to a university where he was incarcerated in a dormitory by university students, subjected to dozens of struggle sessions, and then put into solitary confinement for about 7 years. So many years had gone by that he couldn't distinguish between his two sons because he hadn't seen them for so long. One of his half-sisters was persecuted to death. And Xi Jinping in the 1980s talked about the reason he wanted to become a member of the Chinese Communist Party was to prevent a cultural revolution from never happening again. So whether or not what he's doing has elements of the Cultural Revolution, the way that he talks about it, and we can talk about why that is the case more, is very different. And he contextualizes it based on his past. So why do I think we see this continuity in Xi Jinping? Well, first is there is some continuity. Xi's actions in the economy in particular show this. There hasn't actually been a big change in the ratio of public to private enterprise until 2021. As David Dollar recently wrote for this China Leadership Monitor, sectors of the economy have continued to be liberalized, most notably automobiles and financial services. China received a historically high amount of foreign direct investment in 2021, suggesting that private investors can still find niches in the Chinese economy. So I think that Xi Jinping sees security as something necessary for the economy, but the economy also necessary for security, and that there's a balance between trying to stabilize the regime politically and ideologically, but still continuing to benefit from the outside world, especially economic relations, to buy time and achieve that economic growth, which I think he understands is necessary also for the security side to work as well. I think another reason Xi Jinping is so careful about talking about the past is the Xi family history, in quite dramatic ways, is a story of the lessons of how dangerous debates about party history can be. So his father, Xi Zhongxun, was persecuted then from the leadership in 1962 because he supported publication of a novel that some people in the elite thought was a way of disparaging Mao's own contributions to the revolution. I think Xi Jinping, who cares a lot about stability within the party, appreciates how destabilizing it would be if he was explicit about departing from reform and opening. And I think that explains why, when he talks about reform and opening, he says that even though it created real problems that needed to be solved, he is the right person to solve them to save reform and opening. And finally, I think that this mix of ideology and pragmatism is old hat for Xi Jinping, that he's someone who's seen both the problems and advantages of the Mao and the Deng era, and he and the intellectuals surrounding him describe what he's trying to do as both a new and middle path. So that's ideology. Let me finish by talking a little bit about elite politics. So some of the differences between Xi Jinping and the immediate past are really quite striking. There's obviously no retirement ages, no inclusion of individuals viewed as not members of Xi's camp. He picked someone, Li Qiang, who had a terrible reputation because of what happened in Shanghai, to be premier. These are choices that went beyond what most analysts thought would happen. And the markets certainly were worried about what that lineup meant for China. At the same time, I want to emphasize that this Chinese system has always been extraordinarily leader-friendly, and that Xi Jinping has a lot more in common with his predecessors, especially Deng, than people think. So the idea that Deng cared about institutionalization, cared about post-Mao guardrails, has not withstood the new evidence that has come to bear over the last 5 to 10 years. Let me give some examples. So people used to think that during the 1980s, there was a contest between these two different factions, Deng Xiaoping, the liberal reformer, and Chen Yun, the conservative statist, and that Chen was able to buck and oppose Deng when he wanted to. But the new evidence shows that actually Chen always put Deng's authority as the #1 priority, that Chen actually often behaved in a cowardly way. In fact, Mao Zedong said that Chen Yun was the type of person who would jump under a table if a leaf landed on his head. His health was quite poor. He only worked for a few hours a week. On a lot of big picture issues, he was on the same page as Deng, especially with regards to politics. And even though they differed on the economy, whenever Deng made up his mind, Chen would never dare resist that decision after it was made. Chen Yun was not able to use the institutionalization that allegedly happened to get his voice heard. In fact, he would go to the general secretaries of the 1980s, people like Hu Yaobang and Zhao Ziyang, and say, why don't we ever have Politburo Standing Committee meetings? And Zhao Ziyang once said, you have to go talk to Deng about that. I'm just a secretary. And then Chen walked away muttering, oh, a secretary. And of course, what Zhao Ziyang was saying was, I don't have the power to do that. It's Deng that does. And Deng doesn't want to have a meeting because he doesn't want to give you a chance to speak. People have said that China will now be unpredictable because it has ended collective leadership, unlike what was going on during the Deng era. But China was much more unpredictable during the Deng era than I think China has proven to be under Xi Jinping. Why do I say that? Well, in 1979, Deng Xiaoping launched a war against Vietnam, even though he was the only person within the leadership who wanted that to happen. In 1988, he introduced price reform, despite wide skepticism within the elite, a choice that almost destroyed reform and opening because it was so disastrous. In 1989, almost no one within the Chinese Communist Party top echelons wanted a violent solution to the student protesters. Deng wanted it, and that's what happened. And then in 1992, when Deng was not even head of the Central Military Commission, he was able to engineer a new start to reform and opening simply by taking a trip to the South and expressing his views. These are not signs of collective leadership acting in a stable and predictable way. So why was this the case? Well, Deng explicitly thought that the system only worked with a core, with someone who could make final decisions and impose stability on the party because of that individual's absolute authority. Interestingly, he said that one of the reasons Chinese communist systems are better are because they're so decisive. And he talked about the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan as a good example, because all the Soviets needed to do was have a Politburo meeting and they invaded. And of course, that's an interesting anecdote because the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan was so disastrous. But Deng Xiaoping would talk about the United States as inherently inefficient because they had three governments, by which he meant the legislative, judicial, and executive branches. So Deng was somebody who was hoped by many in the elite would be a sort of George Washington figure, that he would create these new institutions, but Deng did not believe that that was the correct way to move forward. He wanted to make the party more efficient. He didn't want to constrain the party, especially the top leader. Why was Deng successful at that? Well, there was a taboo against factions. Nobody would dare to work in concert with each other within the elite. People have asked why these general secretaries I just mentioned to you, who were pro-reform, Hu Yaobang and Zhao Ziyang, didn't work together. Well, the answer was as soon as they started working together, Deng would remove them, because that wasn't how the system worked. There was a sense widely that the party only worked with the core. Deng had extraordinary prestige as one of the leaders of the revolutionary generation. He also had a very specific personal relationship with the top leaders within the military. But Deng was different from Xi Jinping in some ways. He ruled from behind the curtain. He wasn't involved in the day-to-day decision-making like Xi Jinping was. I think in some ways that Xi Jinping, by being both the core in terms of authority and decision-making, might be actually be a reaction to some of the pathologies of the Deng era, which we can talk about. And Xi Jinping, I think, shares many of Deng's strengths in terms of this sense of needing a core and weak institutionalization. So in terms of what's new since the 20th Party Congress, I think that even before that Congress, Xi was already dominant. That the Politburo Standing Committee, even before the 20th Party Congress, was a Xi Jinping faction. Also, I want to emphasize that absolute power has manifested in different ways in China at different times. So Mao Zedong was certainly the absolute leader in the 1950s, but counterintuitively, precisely because he was so powerful, people felt comfortable coming to him and disagreeing with him, because at least on flexible differences and by putting it in the broader terms of what they thought Mao wanted, because they understood that those challenges would not be interpreted as politically problematic. Also, we've seen that absolute dominance manifests in different issue areas. So Mao felt more comfortable talking about some issues as opposed to others. The politics of personality on different issues also was quite mattered a lot. So whether Mao trusted a particular individual and the political skills of that individual, I think were quite significant. And what's interesting is that at precisely the moment that people thought that Xi Jinping's China would be more ideological and double down on the policies that we had seen, we actually saw a course correction. So I think that the full ramifications of the new leadership lineup haven't been fully understood. So again, I want to emphasize that there's a lot to this new idea that Xi Jinping is more ideological. He cares about ideology in the ways that I suggested. He really wants people to believe in the party. He really believes in continuous revolution. We shouldn't discount the importance of how powerful he is as a leader. But the two takeaways I'd like you to leave with first are that in terms of ideology, Xi is a person with multiple centers of gravity, that he will get pushed in different directions by events, doesn't entirely care about one thing, and has some capacity to maneuver among those goals. And with regards to elite politics, there is much more continuity than we think in terms of a very leader-friendly system. And also that we don't know exactly what meetings at Zhongnanhai look like and shouldn't assume that they're fundamentally different from the past. Now, in terms of policy implications, if you subscribe to the view that China is ideological and that there are inherent pathologies to the leadership structure, that's good news in this if you want a weak China. But if you see Xi Jinping as someone who is still capable of course correction, is still someone who can move with the situation, where decision-making isn't entirely pathological, that in a few months, it may look very different from what it looked like a few months ago. Under zero COVID and the real estate market plummeting and poor relations with the rest of the world, we've seen over the last few months China recognizing those problems and trying to do something about them. So I'm not coming here tonight to say good things about Xi Jinping and that we shouldn't worry about China. And that in fact, if you see these trends that I've just discussed, that there may be more resilience to the system than people in DC have been implying recently in their estimates of where China is going. So I'll stop there.
Well, I really appreciated your opening remarks, and I wanted to touch on one thing that you mentioned in particular that I felt was very insightful, which was your line that we shouldn't essentialize Xi Jinping, which I think is particularly astute because you often hear these very extreme narratives about China. For example, I know a lot of people in USCSSO and a lot of you are astute China watchers yourself. Have any of you guys read Martin Jacks' When China Will Rule the World back in like 2011 or 2007 or so? You know, there's those narratives that, you know, China will replace us. And then you have those narratives that if you guys watch YouTube, you see those clickbait videos where China's entire financial system will collapse in 5 minutes, right? So there's these very extreme narratives about China. And I think, like you said, we need to treat the Chinese political system, and especially with Xi Jinping, with more nuance and consideration. And I think perhaps a great way to get started into kind of treating it with more nuance is talking about Xi Jinping's upbringing, and particularly the relationship his father had in shaping his political development. Now, for those who don't know, Xi Jinping's father, Xi Zhongxun, was actually a prominent Chinese political figure in his own right. He was a revolutionary leader during the Mao era. He was, well, there were a period of rectifications and purges and reinstitutionalizations into the Chinese Communist Party, but he eventually landed himself in the Deng administration in a prominent role as the party chief of Guangdong, where he became famous for his facilitation of the special economic zones. And obviously now we think of Shenzhen, the Pearl River Delta, a lot of that is associated with Guangdong. And so you get this narrative that Xi Zhongxun is this sort of liberal reformer. And I think when we look today at Xi Jinping, where, you know, as the West, we see this crackdown on the private sector, or we interpret it as such. And, you know, you see these arguments in newspaper periodicals that perhaps Xi Jinping is disgracing the legacy of his father or acting in a way that's very different than a lot of people anticipated. And I was hoping that you would weigh in on, you know, that argument about Xi Zhongxun's influence on Xi Jinping, and if he isn't diverging from Xi Zhongxun, how has Xi Zhongxun influenced the political development of Xi Jinping?
So what was very interesting is when Xi Jinping became the new leader of China, there were these meetings in Beijing of pro-reform liberal intellectuals, many of whom had been high-ranking officials themselves who had known Xi Jinping's father, Xi Zhongxun. And they're convinced that Xi Jinping is going to be a reformer, largely because of their understanding of Xi Zhongxun. And people would even say that within the reformist camp, Xi Zhongxun was the most quintessential reformer. And so for him to diverge from that path would be an unfilial act, essentially. So when Xi Jinping started giving speeches, especially the one on the collapse of the Soviet Union and what lessons he drew from that, they were shocked. They were quite surprised by that. And people who don't like Xi Jinping have drawn upon the legend of the father to take political swipes at him, in part because they were so disappointed and surprised. On the other hand, people who like Xi Jinping, especially those who are within the propaganda apparatus, talk about how the reason Xi Jinping is so dedicated to the revolution, to the party, is that he grew up within a family that saw this kind of thing as a family business. Now, there's different ways to think about what the actual conclusions Xi Jinping drew, which is a big question and a complicated question. But let me draw out some initial thoughts for you. So Xi Jinping was born in 1953. At that time, his father was essentially the right-hand man to Zhou Enlai, working in the state council. He went to a school for the offspring of high-ranking leaders, where they would literally read books like Successor to the Revolution. We know that at home, Xi Zhongxun used to tell the children about stories from the revolution, rather dramatic ones. He was nearly killed on numerous occasions. And one time he was almost eaten by a leopard, things like that. And Xi Jinping later said that he listened to this kind of thing until he had calluses on his ears. Xi Jinping was very strict, even within the standards of Beijing at this time. They were very frugal in terms of what they ate at home. The Xi family was actually seen as kind of more bumpkin-esque tool for Chinese speakers than many families within the elite. And the evidence suggests that's not just a story that the Xi family has tried to tell, and that some people thought that the Xi family went even a little bit too far in terms of the disciplinarian ethos. But the reason for that was there was a fear that the offspring of these high-ranking cadres would be poor inheritors to the revolution because they had been divorced from the people because they were growing up on these compounds in Beijing. So that was one of the reasons for why these families were so strict. Mao, in fact, said explicitly that the offspring of high-ranking cadres are a disaster, right? Now, what's interesting about Xi Jinping is that his father was purged in 1962, several years before the beginning of the Cultural Revolution. So for many years, he would have been suffering this, I think probably disgrace is a good word, of being the only kid almost in this classroom whose father was considered one of the 5 black elements, a political bastard, essentially. And then when the Cultural Revolution started, a lot of those first generation offspring were Red Guards and were especially active, but Xi Jinping would have been allowed to do that along with them because of his status. So, during the Cultural Revolution, because he's the son of this fallen figure, he suffers quite extensively. And then when he emerges and starts climbing up the party hierarchy in the 1980s, it's the opposite problem, where people see the advances of these cadre offspring as a manifestation of nepotism, right? So first he goes from being, this disgraced son of a disgraced official to now people looking down on him because of this view that the only reason he's achieving what he's achieving is because of his father. And Xi Jinping actually, interestingly enough, has bragged that he suffered more than other children of these offspring. And he talks about how he's less often hedonistic from them because he wanted to dedicate himself to the cause, I think in part because of these experiences. So the other interesting thing here, and I'll end on this, is so Xi Jinping's father was persecuted 5 times by his own party. And then the question becomes, how do you remain loyal to a party that did something like that to your father? But I think the real question is, how do you not remain loyal to an organization like that, right? To see your father go through so much, but as a weird manifestation of Bolshevik political culture, take pride in that. to see the suffering that you go through as an ennobling experience that rededicates you to the cause and demonstrates just how much you care about it. So Xi Zhongxun, when people would complain to him in the 1980s, he would say, well, I bet you weren't under so much solitary confinement as I was, or I bet you don't have scars from manacles like I do. So I think that looking at something like that as a young person really probably has a pretty fundamental impact on you. So.
I think it's interesting going back to 2013 when, we get the news that Xi Jinping has taken the highest office in China, and, immediately, sinologists and China watchers alike are trying to attempt to understand and explain what is going on and what the implications are. And, as you mentioned a lot, you talk about how in the West, you had journalists like Nick Kristof at the New York Times who, anticipated that Xi Jinping was going to be a reformer. But also in China too, you had a lot of scholars who had the same view. And I think Xi Zhongxun was a very large part of that because, Chinese scholars especially recognized the legacy of Xi Zhongxun and anticipated that surely, well, the Xi clan must continue subsequently. But, I think from the Western perspective, we came at it a slightly different angle in terms of our misinterpretation of Xi Jinping or who he would be as a leader. And I think it more comes to his relationship with Jiang Zemin. Now, Jiang Zemin, for those unfamiliar, was, largely credited with continuing the series of reforms implemented under Deng Xiaoping. China's entry into the World Trade Organization is an example of such. And, when you look at the 17th National Party Congress, when Xi Jinping was appointed as sort of the heir apparent along with Li Keqiang, there was a lot of information that suggested that Zheng Qinghong, which was Jiang Zemin's chief ally, was very influential in intervening to make that happen. And so I guess the question I would be interested in asking you is, how is it possible that, both domestic, Chinese scholars and also Western scholars can just be so wrong about the nature of China's political system? Because, you think about it like, well, surely Jiang Zemin's picking a protege that would follow in his footsteps. How could Jiang Zemin miscalculate on the nature of his legacy? Or are we misunderstanding what Jiang Zemin was looking for? What do you think about that?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question and one that's hard to answer. I'll begin by recommending everyone in this room read a chapter by a man named Fred Tevis, Teiwes, called The Black Box of Chinese Politics. So Fred Tevis works on Chinese elite politics, obviously, and he has been at the forefront of explaining to the rest of the world what new Chinese sources say about Chinese elite politics. And in this article, what he does is say, well, here's what people thought at the time was going on in Maoist China or Dengist China, and look how wrong almost all of them were, right? Now, what's interesting is, as you were saying, this isn't just a case of Westerners being fundamentally incapable of understanding China, although I think that maybe there are structural reasons for why it's harder, especially for outsiders, to get it. But what's really striking is how often even insiders get things wrong, right? So these people who in 2012 were increasingly surprised at who Xi Jinping turned out to be, they knew a lot about Chinese politics and they knew a lot about Xi Jinping. In fact, one of the people was a man named Li Rui, who was Mao's former secretary. He was a sort of mentor to Xi Jinping during the 1980s. He was one of the people who believed that Xi Jinping was going to be a particular type of individual, and was, I think, particularly disappointed because he thought that he had that close relationship with him. I also want to mention that, in terms of succession politics, right? Succession politics has always been sort of the dangerous third rail, right, for elite politics. And that's one of the reasons that Mao got rid of so many of his named successors. That's one of the reasons why Deng Xiaoping got rid of so many of his named successors, is because you are never really quite sure what that successor is going to do. So there's a very heightened sensitivity to any sense that the deputy you've picked is misunderstanding what you want or doesn't have the kind of proclivities that you were hoping for, right? So I think one of the reasons maybe Xi Jinping has at least temporarily put a pause on Chinese successions is he looked to the past and saw how poorly the system has been at managing them successfully. Now, sooner or later, there's going to have to be a succession, and we can talk about what kinds of things are probably going through his mind when he thinks about that. But I think that's the best answer I can provide for you. The one last thing I want to say about Jiang Zemin So I recently did a short piece for China File about the legacy of Jiang Zemin. And one of the things I said was, we know so little about the Jiang Zemin era. We have all of these things that come to mind when we talk about Jiang Zemin, that Jiang Zemin was this or Jiang Zemin was that. But we have a lot on the 1980s, actually. Lots of documents have been smuggled out. They get to American university libraries one way or another. Lots of stuff has been published in Hong Kong. Lots of people who were pretty prominent in the 1980s either left China to write memoirs or decided to write memoirs anyways from all corners of the political spectrum. And we're slowly starting to get that kind of thing from China during the Jiang era, but just exactly why Xi Jinping was picked, what his relationship was with the Jiang Zemin, we need to be very cautious about how much we actually think we know about that.
And it's funny because, you wonder how much China watchers and sinologists have learned from their, incorrect characterizations back in 2012, because now you see a new wave of attempting to understand what's going on now. And you see the current rhetoric, when reacting to the common prosperity, the 共同富裕 campaign that Xi Jinping has, really started kind of in late 2020 with the delisting of Ant. But certainly ramped up in 2021, and then we can kind of get more into that later. But with these actions, I think a lot of China watchers, trying to derive the significance out of it, have basically looked to explain it through ideology, right? And saying, well, okay, well, maybe now that Xi Jinping was very pragmatic, very reserved through much of his career. Now that he's at the central leadership, he's revealing his true colors. He's actually a raving leftist. And now he's achieving his dreams of, neo-Maoist ideology, or fulfilling the dreams of, the so-called new left political faction in China. And, I'm wondering, because, no one's really interrogating the question, is Xi Jinping pursuing common prosperity for non-ideological reasons? And so I would be interested in asking you, do you think that common prosperity is derived from a sort of ideology of Xi Jinping, or are there perhaps different reasons why he might be pursuing it?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So I wrote a kind of long form piece for the Wilson Center that's called Xi Jinping and Ideology. And when I begin that piece, I say that there are dozens of definitions of ideology, right? And very often ideology is used in a way that essentially is meant to disparage someone. So when you say someone is ideological, often what you mean is they can't see the real world because they have these blinders on, or they can't be stopped because they're not motivated by material incentives and constraints. They are the type of person who will stop at nothing to achieve what they want. But other people think of ideology basically as a frame of reference that every individual in the world needs to make sense of the world, because every decision that you come to, inherently there has to be some kind of interpretation of what the evidence says, and that you're going to bring some kind of things to bear. So we need to, when we talk about ideology, we should be explicit about what we mean when we choose which of any of those definitions. But when it comes to Xi Jinping and it comes to ideology, he's actually, I think, been remarkably consistent in what he thought, even from before he came to power. So people who were surprised, I think, maybe might not have been if they looked carefully at these themes that have come up, even I think since the 80s. And one of those themes was that it's really absolutely fundamentally necessary for people to really believe in the Chinese Communist Party, to have an emotional attachment to it. And that if you lose that, you lose everything. Now, why did he have this fixation? Well, I think there's a couple of reasons. One reason was that during the Cultural Revolution, a lot of the people of his generation were fundamentally disillusioned, right? Because you start the Cultural Revolution really charged up and believing in Mao. But by the end of the Cultural Revolution, everybody could see just what a disaster it was. Everybody knew that something had gone fundamentally wrong. So in the 1980s, a lot of people who were like Xi Jinping, a lot of these so-called princelings, they wanted to make up for lost time. They wanted to have fun. They wanted to study overseas. They wanted to make money. The other thing is, in the 1980s, right, you would see people trying to figure out what to believe in when nobody really believed in communism that much anymore. And that, I think, in Xi Jinping's view, was one of the reasons for what happened at Tiananmen Square. And then one of the reasons that people believed or started to recognize that he was more leftist than they thought he was was a speech he gave in 2012. And what he talked about was the collapse of the Soviet Union. And why did he say the Soviet Union collapsed? He said because people didn't believe in the cause anymore. And part of the reason for that was the historical nihilism, the dragging out of Stalin and criticizing Stalin. This is why I think people who think that Xi Jinping criticizes Deng are wrong, because I think that for Xi Jinping, criticizing any of those old leaders is very, very, very dangerous, right? So that was not really getting to common prosperity, but in terms of common prosperity, I really like your insight there, which is that it's probably wrong to think of it as either purely ideological or purely rational, right? But I also want to say that we've seen when he talks about common prosperity, as I mentioned in my remarks, he often contextualizes it to give a lot of wiggle room in terms of what it actually means. And when he talks about it, he often talks about it in a way that seems to me intentionally targeted towards assuaging worried Westerners about their money and whether or not China's going to continue to grow, right? But he also, I think, maybe for ideological reasons, maybe because he's worried about what the implications for the regime are if income gaps in society continue to get worse. That's something you want to do something about that, right? Like whatever your ideological precepts are, it's probably worthwhile to take into account the danger of how people are going to react if they feel like they're not benefiting from economic growth. So what I think that means is he has multiple goals at once. And what that means is you can maneuver, right? So when he looks at the outside world and he sees people really worried about common prosperity, you can talk about it in a particular way. And when things are going better and you want to pursue a more transformational agenda, then you can push on that at a different time. Or you try to do it in a sort of better, more savvy way. Now, certainly they screwed up big time, right? In terms of the rollout that happened last year and led to all of these conclusions that reform and opening was over. I don't think that Xi Jinping wanted those conclusions to be drawn. And I think that what he's been doing is try to, bring people away from that conclusion. But whether or not it's successful or not is hard, in part because he does care about multiple goals. And one of those goals is ideology. When people read this stuff about Marxism, they think that he is a Marxist in the sense that he is transformational and radical in ways that make them see common prosperity in a particular way.
I'm really glad that you brought up the 2012 speech by Xi Jinping that a lot of people look to. I think looking at the new scholarship now, I think an increasing amount of Chinese researchers are also looking at Xi Jinping's trip to Chongqing and his inspection of Bo Xilai at the time and what he said and actually how it compares quite favorably to how he's turned out as a leader now. I think one thing I really wanted to pick your brain on was how strikingly similar Xi Jinping's agenda looks like to the so-called Bo Xilai playbook. For those of you who are unaware about Bo Xilai, he was once a rising star in the Chinese Communist Party. He was once finance minister and then more famously, or rather infamously, was the party chief of Chongqing, where he basically cultivated this local fiefdom. He reintroduced this sort of neo-Maoist red culture iconography, creating this sort of cult of personality, while at the same time pursuing the so-called economic development scheme known as the Chongqing model. And when you look at Xi Jinping today, and you look at a lot of the policy proposals, such as the anti-corruption campaign, which was very similar to Bo Xilai's Changhong Dahei, the sing red songs, and then the crush organized crime bit of that sort of lyrical. And then you also have the situation with Xi Jinping where common prosperity itself was, actually a maxim that Bo Xilai brought from the dead, from the Mao era. And so, we talked about how Xi Zhongxun was an influence on Xi Jinping's life, or maybe Jiang Zemin was. Do you think Xi Jinping really learned a lot from Bo Xilai because they're sort of ideological brethren? Or is it perhaps that Xi Jinping saw the success of what Bo Xilai was doing in terms of rallying people around the flag of the Communist Party, like what you were saying earlier about how the party is so important to Xi Jinping personally?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. Let me provide a little bit of background there. So Bo Xilai's father, Bo Yibo, was a very prominent revolutionary as well. During the 1980s, Xi Zhongxun and Bo Yibo did not get along. Xi Zhongxun was not a big fan of Bo Yibo for reasons I can talk about if people like that kind of party history stuff. But what's really quite interesting is that despite these grudges, among the first generation leadership. Bo's children and Xi Zhongxun's children apparently have always gotten along pretty okay, and that the Xi kids would refer to Bo as Uncle Bo. They would go to the Bo household to talk about party history. And I asked a princeling about this once, and they said they don't really feel motivated by the grudges of their parents for several reasons. One is that they felt that everybody just persecuted each other, right? So the whole grudges is wrong. That a lot of those so-called persecutions actually were the result of Mao and Deng, but ultimately that they were united commonly by loyalty to the party, and that's a real good reason to get along, right? So the story of Bo Xilai is quite interesting, right? So Bo Xilai, similarly to Xi Jinping, suffered a lot during the Cultural Revolution. In fact, Bo Xilai's mother was persecuted to death during the early years of the Cultural Revolution. Bo Xilai made a very interesting comment. Somebody asked him what he thought about Mao Zedong. He said, you know, thinking about this, reflecting on this, I shouldn't like Mao Zedong. I shouldn't like him because of what happened to my mother and what happened to my family. But ultimately, Mao Zedong is the only legitimate capital, 正资产 for Chinese speakers, and that we need to believe in him, essentially. And that is a rather interesting way of putting it, because it suggests that even his seemingly radical leftist ideology was motivated by a utilitarian conclusion that this was something that was useful for the regime to play up on, right? Even though when he was saying rationally, I shouldn't like Mao Zedong, right? We don't know what Bo Xilai would have been like if he became the top leader. What's interesting is how different the personalities between Bo Xilai and Xi Jinping are, though, right? Because it would have been hard to pin Xi Jinping down with a particular ideology, because as I was saying earlier, he always tended to say this on the one hand, on the other hand, say some things that people on the left would like, some things that people on the right would like. He also was somebody where people were struck by how cautious he was. One example is this guy Li Rui that I mentioned earlier went to go see him after a big promotion, said, your position is different now, you can speak out more. And Xi Jinping said, oh, I'm not like you. You know how to play ping pong so that the ball just hits the edge. I don't know how to do that. And people would talk to him and walk away from him not having a good sense of who he was, Xi Jinping. But Bo Xilai was making a name for himself and trying to make a name for himself in a way that created his political capital, right? Some people have surmised, and this is really kind of a psychological thing that I'm a little uncomfortable with, but the idea is that because Xi Jinping's father was purged earlier than the other members of other families, and the fact that Xi Jinping was so young when it happened might have taught Xi Jinping caution in a way that it didn't teach Bo Xilai, whose formative event was in the early years of the Cultural Revolution, running around and causing a lot of trouble. I think that's the best I can do with your question. So.
I wanted to delve into further this idea, because you've been talking about how Xi Jinping is both deeply practical, right, but also has this reverence for the party line. And I was sort of looking at, is there an intentionality there when you look at some of Xi Jinping's agenda and comparing it to Bo Xilai? Because like Hu Jintao, I feel like Xi Jinping really understands how in order for the party to maintain its legitimacy, it has to appeal to the working class. It needs to maintain the sort of image of a sort of party of the proletariat, or party of the Nomingong, the agricultural workers. And one thing I would want to ask you is, if you look at Xi Jinping's promises, and some of them he hasn't delivered on, but like hukou reform, or the lions, the corruption purge, or if you look at now with common prosperity, it seems like these are all very populist policies. And I was wondering if you also saw this sort of inherent populism within Xi Jinping's agenda, or is that perhaps a misreading of his policy platform?
So I think there is definitely a populist element to what he's doing, and we shouldn't discount that. But I think it's something that's tempered by other goals, including economic growth, and the other element of populism that you were talking about, this Maoist imagery and that kind of thing. That's a big deal, and he cares about that a lot, and he sees it as fundamental to regime security that people are faithful to the cause. And one of the ways you do that is you talk about party history in a way that makes it seem like one triumph after another. You play up certain things from the Maoist era that speak to people's emotions. But I use this metaphor of a lightning in a bottle. You want it to bubble, but you don't want it to boil over, right? So you want to use that to create a sense of idealism and motivation, but not starting a new cultural revolution.
I think, for the last bit of our event, I did want to kind of do more of a forecasting, although notoriously it's difficult to do that in Chinese politics. But, looking at what Xi Jinping has done recently, which I think has put into question the sort of narrative of Xi Jinping, the ultimate leftist or the ultimate ideologue that we've been talking about today, which is the changes that have been happening to common prosperity. And if you look at a lot of the key hallmarks of common prosperity, namely, which was the antitrust levy against Alibaba, there was the data privacy probe into Didi, there was the crackdown on New Oriental, and then so forth. I think most famously, right, the 3 red lines policy against the over-leveraged real estate developers, which really appeased, this groundswell of Chinese netizens that were angry that they, were still paying their mortgages, but they didn't have finished apartments. And it seems that Xi Jinping has, pivoted significantly from this common prosperity narrative. And, you've often talked about how Xi Jinping is this deeply practical figure. Do you think that this is evidence to what you have said earlier in your work about how, Xi Jinping is learning from his mistakes? Or is this, kind of a temporary pivot to stabilize the Chinese economy? Maybe Liu He was whispering in his ear, and that actually common prosperity will return once the Chinese economy has stabilized.
So one thing to use as a historical analogy is Deng Xiaoping, right? So Deng Xiaoping talked a lot about reform and opening, but he also talked a lot about the 4 cardinal principles. The 4 cardinal principles were a very leftist, very conservative formulation. And what Deng Xiaoping would do was, when he thought that liberals were going too far, he would use the 4 cardinal principles as a weapon against them. And when he thought conservatives were making choices that was endangering reform and opening, he would use reform and opening as a weapon against them. So Deng as a politician and Xi Jinping as a politician, they have these different goals, and they move among them as the situation demands. So I'm sure that Xi Jinping has long-term objectives, but he also has immediate challenges. And what was very interesting to me was that in the last few weeks, he gave a couple speeches where he was reflecting publicly on the dialectic of strategic ambitions and tactical choices. And so what that means is, I'm sure he has an idea of the general place that China should get to, but that you need to be able to recognize that it won't be a direct line, and that it will. So in that sense, it's both, right? It's both a strategic thing, it's both a tactical thing. Both are constantly in his mind, but that, within the broader strategic goals, and we can debate those and what they mean and what they mean for American interests. But within that, you can do a lot of different types of things that you can't rely on this idea that him being ideological will immediately give you an answer to, or this idea that there are inherent pathologies to decision-making will give you an answer to. And I think that China's ability to deal with those problems are probably greater than people were thinking just a few months ago, when it looked like China was on the ropes because of zero COVID and poor relations with everyone, and the economy suffering because of the real estate market. So.
I'm going to ask one more question, and then we'll open up to Q&A. So please think of questions you'd like to ask Dr. Tarigian, since this is a wonderful opportunity to do so. So picking up on that, to kind of wrap up the discussion that we've been talking about today about, really how useful is ideology in attempting to understand the Chinese Communist Party. I think a lot of us are all interested in potentially working in a career and, looking into Chinese studies, or perhaps looking into Chinese domestic or elite politics ourselves. And so for young people who are trying to understand China better, do you think that, it's a good idea to sort of, try to attempt to categorize Chinese politicians as either rightists or leftists or elitists or princelings? Or is that a danger? And if so, how do you recommend, young people such as ourselves, or me included, to try to study China in the future?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the argument of my book that you just showed the audience is that debates on ideology and policy were neither the reason for why there were power struggles after Stalin and Mao died, and also don't explain the outcomes. But that's not to say that people don't have different views. It's not to say that there are people who argue with each other within the party. But in terms of elite politics, I think that this idea that probably people in the West would find familiar and intuitive, that politics is a personality contest, and that if you're popular because your policies are good and you promise things that you will win, that's not really kind of how the Chinese system works, because it is a Leninist system. With regards to whether it makes sense to divide people into different factions, I think that personally, and then if you read what other people say about this, you'll get different views, that the idea of factions has always been overstated. People used to think that Mao was this revolutionary, romantic, but Liu Shaoqi was this bureaucratic modernizer. We now know that actually there were not systematic policy differences at all between Mao Zedong and Liu Shaoqi. The 1980s, I was just saying that Chen Yun was really not the leader of a faction in the way that people thought, but so why don't these factions appear? Well, one is that there's this taboo against people acting in concert with each other, right? Because it's so dangerous to the party for there to be open warfare going on. That's one of the reasons why people think that they need a core, is to prevent that kind of thing, right? The other is that people's views tend to sort of be all over the place and don't fit very well on a right-left spectrum. So Xi Zhongxun, I just mentioned him as, people thought of him as this consummate reformer. Well, first of all, if you're in the party, however liberal you're supposed to be, it's very relative, because you're still a member of the Chinese Communist Party, right? But also, Xi Zhongxun, even though he deserved credit for the special economic zones in significant ways, he opposed the household contracting responsibility system in the countryside, which was a huge element of the reform and opening process. And it's because of these ideological hangups, in the sense of he had this view of collectivization being the path to communism, right? And then also, like, whether you worked with someone doesn't necessarily mean you're in their same faction, partly because I don't know about you, but a lot of people who work with someone don't end up actually liking that person, right? So you can't use these, like, the fact that they worked in a particular institution means that this person's automatically their protege. Personalities matter a lot, whether or not you get along with someone. Also, your views evolve. Like, for example, one person came up in the state planning commissions during the 50s and 60s, and precisely because he worked in them, he became very pro-reform in the 80s because he knew they didn't work, right? So I could go on, but for a lot of reasons, I think that factions can be overstated as a useful tool, even though I would say it's clumpy but not blocky, would be one way of putting it, in terms of the cohesiveness or lack thereof of factions.
Well, I've certainly talked enough. Let's open it up to the floor. Does anyone have questions they'd like to pose to Dr. Turikian? Yes. And Emily, could you, do you mind passing the mic?
Thank you for a detailed analysis of the Chinese president, Xi Jinping. I've never heard a discussion as detailed as this in this country. However, let me ask you a question. You know, there is a bipartisan dislike for the Chinese president, and I'm having problem pronouncing his name. That's why I won't repeat Xi Jinping. Okay, and it's kind of blind dislike for him that we see in this country. Now, is it that the CIA has not been able to infiltrate him as it was able to do Gorbachev? Because at one point, Gorbachev was an evil empire. And then once he was well infiltrated by CIA, he became the guy we can do business with. The same Reagan did that. So I'm just wondering, are we in that process that here's a Chinese evil empire, and then at some point we will suddenly burst open and say, now we can do business with him?
You know, what's interesting about Gorbachev, a lot of the US archives from the Reagan and Bush 41 administrations have been declassified. And what's really striking is how wrong the US got Gorbachev, even when Gorbachev was very serious about change within the Soviet Union, right? So I guess Gorbachev was surprising in one way, Xi Jinping was surprising in another way, but it shows that the prolonged delays that it took for there to get a sense in Washington, D.C. that Gorbachev was different and serious shows just how hard it is to get this kind of thing correct, right? So the ability, I think, for outsiders to guess is challenging, but as I was saying before, Gorbachev was picked in part because of a sense that there needed to be some change within the Soviet Union. But if they would have picked him knowing what he was going to do, I think that's probably an open question. So there's always debates about structure and agency for us as social scientists. And unfortunately, for the study of places like China and Russia, so much depends on what one person thinks. It's not easy, right? So I went to one talk by somebody who has spent a lot of time studying Vladimir Putin, and there were questions about why it's so hard for people to guess what he's going to do. And part of it is he doesn't tell people, or he lies to people, and the only person who knows what he's going to do is him, which makes it really hard to study these types of regimes. And as I was trying to get across, just because you can identify views that you associate with someone, that's a guide for how they think about the world, but how it will manifest in a particular political challenge is not, it's not a easy procedure, a formulaic procedure to put those things together and come up with a good guess, right? So unfortunately, these are just inherently challenging problems that we can structure by looking to the past, but we should be humble about how much we think we know.
Let's have another question. Yes.
So there's this, thank you, idea that like there's a lot of like backstabbing and really dark power struggles within the Chinese Communist Party, but there's also the idea that doing so would hurt your reputation. You talked about the idea that you can't really have factions because there's a taboo. So how cunning do you really think Chinese elite politics is? Is it really like those, old historical tales where, you would kill anyone who helped you build a country or build your program or something like that?
Yeah, that's a really good question and a difficult one to answer because there's so many different things going on at the same time. So I'll draw upon not my own view, but I'll draw upon views of people like Jiang Zemin and Nikita Khrushchev. Jiang Zemin made a very interesting comment when they were momentarily, but seriously debating whether they could create real institutionalization within the party. And Jiang Zemin at this meeting about political reform was saying, what we need to do is really codify the relationship among the Politburo Standing Committee, the Politburo, and the Central Committee, because what we really want to be able to make is the Central Committee really the most authoritative body. And now the Politburo Standing Committee is making all the decisions, so it's very top heavy. But to make real democracy, we need to make it clear when meetings are held and who is beholden to whom and so on. And he said something very interesting. He said, when we're not in the middle of a crisis, this kind of thing works. But as soon as something unexpected happens, it could be very dangerous. And of course, he was talking about the lessons of the Mao era. And a man who used to be Mao's secretary, his name is Hu Qiaomu, he stepped out and said, no, this is not what the party is about. We need to it needs to be decisive. It needs to be top down. We're still a Leninist system. And then Jiang Zemin said, you know what Chinese politics is? It's saying one thing to somebody to their face and something different behind their back. That's what Chinese politics is. It struck me because I had seen a joke Nikita Khrushchev told, where he says there are these two people who meet each other on the street, and they each lie to each other about where they're going, and each of them thinks that the other person is lying and guesses that they're actually going someplace else. And Nikita Khrushchev said that's what politics is, right? So Chinese politics is a knife fight, but it's a knife fight with weird rules, right? So when I said that there aren't factions, it doesn't mean that there aren't struggles, because there are lots of struggles. And in certain periods, they're quite endemic, right? But when they happen, they're constrained in certain ways. One is, as you said, if you go beyond what's absolutely necessary to win, it looks bad. You don't want to do that. But also when you lose, you don't go to the countryside and start a new revolution. Well, why not? The party is your entire life. The party is you agreeing when they tell you to say that white is black. And that's not me saying that. That's what people in the party actually said. This is why people, when they were shot during the Stalinist purges, would say long live Stalin as they were being executed. This is, I mean, I think for us, this is a very unfamiliar form of politics, but it's a kind of politics that made these people's lives meaningful.
Yes, gentlemen. Just wait, the mic is coming your way.
Well, thank you very much. It's a very, very interesting presentation. I'm Albert Keidel. I teach a course here on the Chinese economy, a former Treasury official and China desk. It seemed to me there's an underappreciation of some factors about Xi Jinping, and I wondered what you think about them. One is the continuity of many of his policies and attitudes, both domestically and internationally, from the Hu Jintao period. And the other is the way many of the things that he is doing are reactive to what's happening in the international community, particularly since the Trump administrations, but also in going back to the great financial crisis, which was a great souring of China's recognition of how efficient and effective the United States and its economic systems are. So there's an image of Xi Jinping that came through this presentation of this single force that is now so strange and different in its radical left. And yet, from what I understand, there's a really a wholly different sweep of what Xi Jinping is presenting and reacting to, and including many things interpreted as anti-market or anti-reform, are often actually regulatory improvements. They're cracking down on corruption that Jack Ma would have in trying to deregulate the financial sector, particularly the fintech sector. So can you balance this for me? I got a very strong feeling here about Xi Jinping as this new force. And yet from what I see in so many dimensions, there's just a great deal of continuity and reaction to conditions that he's facing. So thank you very much.
Well, frankly, I'm both pleased and surprised by your remarks. I'm pleased in the sense that I agree with you, and surprised in the sense that the general picture I was trying to get across was more continuity than people thought, including on the economy. So the continuity story here, right? So whether you think Xi Jinping is reflective of continuity or not, there's two ways to go about that. Some people go about it in a way that's intended either to legitimate him or to make him look bad, right? Another way to go about it is to look at specific issue areas and go one by one and see how much continuity is there. And as I was saying in my remarks, including in the economy, perhaps most surprisingly, there's actually a lot of continuity and in some ways more liberalization and more opening to the outside world. It was one of the remarks that I made. And also in terms of reform and opening, as I said before, he is explicit that he is trying to save reform and opening. I mean, he talks about the problems that reform and opening created because he needs to tell a story for why he is in charge. But what is that story? Well, he says the story is that there wasn't someone strong enough in the center to hold things together and get and resolve the problems that everyone wanted to address, meaning including Hu Jintao and Jiang Zemin, right? Meaning he's not rejecting what they wanted. He's just doing a better job of getting what everybody always knew needed to be resolved. And one of the ways to do that is through this model of a core, which is, a way of saying why he deserves to be the core. And in terms of, the international community, what's interesting is when I talk to people who study various aspects of Chinese foreign policy, they see a lot of continuity, especially on the South China Sea, and they see Hu Jintao as actually being more aggressive than is commonly viewed. But when you read Chinese political literature, you're right, where the Chinese say that actually the big shift in China's approach to the outside world wasn't 2012, but was the year of the financial crisis, right? So here is Xi Jinping attributing his predecessor, interestingly enough, to a bigger watershed moment than 2012 when he came to power, right? So no, I mean, one of the things I wanted to say was both in terms of ideology, but also the fact that the Chinese systems have always been leader friendly. I personally see more continuity than I think a lot of people here in DC do. So I'm sorry that I wasn't clear about that. Yeah.
I think we have time for maybe one or two more questions. Yes, Emily.
Thank you for your great analysis of Xi Jinping's ideology. My question is the relation of Xi Jinping's ideology to this new stream of Chinese nationalism. So Xi has had a lot more nationalist rhetoric than his more recent predecessors, especially about South China Sea and Taiwan. So my question was, is this more of a product of his core ideology or of a new security environment that China finds itself in?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So as I was saying before, getting a sense of someone and their views will help you guess how they broadly view the world and interpret the world. But there still is the real world, which means that they need to have a good sense of what is actually happening as well, right? So I think one way of answering your question would be to say that I think probably a lot of people have similar views about the world as Xi Jinping does. I think that that national sentiment is something that's probably pretty common within the elite. It's hard for people to get a sense and a read of what's going on in Zhongnanhai for reasons that we've been describing. I mean, many within the elite historically also haven't had a good sense of what's going on. But Xi Jinping runs a particularly tight ship, right? And people who talk to outsiders probably are more likely to have a particular view, right? Or they decide to express a view that has a political purpose, right? But ultimately, I think that Xi Jinping is quite a powerful leader, and he's partly reflective of what many people think, but probably isn't restrained or egged on by other nationalist voices, and that he sees that as one of the advantages of the Leninist system, which is that what he probably hopes to achieve by firewalling himself from questions of authority, that he can make choices that are independent of immediate sort of political demands.
Well, on that note, I think we will have to wrap up for our speaker event portion. Please give a round of applause to our wonderful guests.